Okay, thank you everyone for coming, and thank you to Corpus Christi for allowing us to use the auditorium. I'll get straight to it and introduce the speakers. So on my far right is Colin Brewer. He's a retired psychiatrist and ex-research fellow at Birmingham. He's a medical journalist and author of several books. He's written for The Spectator, The Guardian, and the New Humanist Journal. And he has a keen interest in history, in the history and origins of religions. Alex O'Connor, to my right, is an Oxford University student here with us. He's got an extremely popular YouTube channel on which he discusses politics, philosophy, science, and religion. To my far left is Mohammed Hijab. He's an academic researcher at SOAS in London, and he's also studied in multiple Islamic institutions. I see Mohammed as a kind of public debater. He roams around London, locking horns with Jews, Muslims, Christians, and atheists alike, and as I'm sure you'll all attest if you've seen his YouTube channel, those are most productive conversations that he's had. Abdullah Al-Andalusi is an international activist for Islam and Muslim affairs. He's given extensive talks and written articles rationally critiquing secularism, liberalism, secular democracy, and materialism. He's also the co-founder of the public discussion forum, the Muslim Debate Initiative, that promotes open dialogue and critical thought. And without further ado, I'll ask one of the proposition to step up, supporting the motion, Islam explains reality better than atheism.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
In the name of God, the gracious, the merciful, I'd like to thank the Oxford Forum and my fellow panelists for facilitating this debate and everyone here for attending. I used to be Christian. My mother was Catholic and my father was secular. I went to a Church of England school and learned the basics of Christian belief. However, with there being so many belief systems, I asked myself a question. How did I know I was born into the correct one? Would I have been something different if I was born and raised elsewhere? I then studied every belief, claim, or worldview I could find to discover the ultimate explanation for all things. In doing so, I found that many explanations couldn't account for many things that I could observe or prove themselves false or fell apart due to their own self-contradictions or contradictions between what they say and reality. For example, I encountered Trinitarian Christianity, which argues that God is both one and three, and that the infinite, immortal God is also a finite, mortal man. I encountered polytheists who argued that there are many gods, some eternal, some who popped out of nothing, who are all infinite but have created and finite human or animal forms, suffer ignorance, tiredness, and even injury. Some Pacific Island religions consider volcanoes who created their island and whose sediments make the ground highly fertile for cultivation to be also eternal and divine. I've also found that many atheistic positions are not any more special or more coherent than these. For example, many materialistic worldviews argue that the universe which we see, which is finite, limited, and changing, is also somehow infinite and eternal at the same time. You just can't see it. Other atheist positions argue that the universe ultimately popped out of nothing, albeit with precisely measured amounts of energy, but no cause to determine that measure. Of course, there are also atheistic worldviews like types of Buddhism, which goes to show that atheism doesn't preclude spirituality, just God. When I encountered Islam, I found something different. That Islam describes God as a being of infinite or inexhaustible power and who possesses intentionality or will. He has no human or animal attributes, forms, natures, or appetites. Islam teaches that God is genderless, does not experience tiredness or ignorance, and exists without peer. Surah Ikhlas of the Quran makes clear, Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim, Qul huwa Allahu ahad. Say God is one, Allahu samad. The self-sufficient, lam yalid wa lam yulad. He does not reproduce, nor was he reproduced. وَلَمْ يَكُنْ لَهُ كُفُوًا أَحَدٌ. There is nothing like him, which means he is without partner, because if there were other infinite gods, they would all limit each other and all would not be infinite or gods at all. This is the Islamic concept of God, a pure indivisible oneness, a cause and initiator for all things, a divine unity behind the multitude of created things. And it is the only explanation that is without contradictions and circular reasoning and does not need to appeal to any mystery to hide faults it simply doesn't have. Islam's message to mankind is to avoid the error of mixing the infinite and the finite together and creating false idols by attributing to limited and finite things the attributes that belong only to the Creator and vice versa. Instead, Islam asks mankind to recognize the infinite alone as the ultimate creator of all things, who is separate from his creation and not like it. Is this a God peculiar to Islam? No. Anyone on earth today or in history who worships an infinite, unlimited creator who willed all things into existence and does not resemble any finite things or creatures worships the same God we do, whatever religion they call themselves. Islam teaches that it is not something new, but merely a reiteration of the same message that has been repeatedly sent down to mankind throughout different times and places, producing commonalities in many religions throughout history. Now to the title of the debate, Islam explains reality better than atheism. Some might say, well, atheism doesn't seek to explain anything. It's only a lack of belief of God or a rejection thereof. But atheism's denial of the existence of God carries the minimum corollary, that reality is completely explainable without God. And they'd be wrong in my estimation. There are 4 aspects of reality that only Islam's concept of God can ultimately and soundly explain, while atheism cannot do so without falling into self-contradiction. And these aspects are change, matter, finitude, and specificity. Atheism rejects the only sound explanation for change. If this moment depended on an infinite number of previous moments and movements, we'd never exist or get here. If I were to say that my opponents can begin their speech after an infinite amount of time, they would never have the chance to start their speeches, as an infinite amount of time can't end or even begin if you think about it. Likewise, if I asked a poor student, not pointing to anyone in particular, for £1 and he didn't have it, and he asked another who was equally poor, and so on, I'd never get that £1 until the chain of students found at least one student who had £1 to begin the chain of lending and eventually get to me. Now, this is known as the infinite regress fallacy, which is the same as asserting a beginning and no beginning at the same time. It is a contradiction and therefore impossible. The existence of change and movement requires a first mover. There's no way around that. And if it is the first mover, it means it chose to move things without being moved by anything else. Therefore, it has a will. This is the key characteristic of God, whose name is Al-Mubdi, in the initiator in the Quran. 2, atheism rejects the only sound explanation for the ultimate basis behind matter. If matter gets its attributes and characteristics because it is made from something more fundamental than it, let's just say subatomic particles and forces, ultimately quarks and bosons, and these things are made of, let's say, quantum vacuum energy or fluctuations in such thing, or superstrings, one or the other for the sake of argument, what is quantum vacuum energy, or what are superstrings, if they even exist, made of? If something else, and that's made of something else, where does it stop? If it has no end, then nothing would exist. It's like saying a branch is held aloft from the ground by an infinitely tall tree, or a pond has no bottom to hold up the water, despite the water being at a specific level. The fact that anything exists and continues to exist proves there must be something fundamental that is supporting all these things, that itself isn't made of anything else and has no parts, and therefore is self-sustaining. The Quran calls God Ar-Razzaq, the sustainer, Al-Hafidh, the preserver, Al-Samad, the self-sufficient. 3, atheism rejects the only sound explanation for finite things. If something has size, shape, charge, or a specific characteristic, what determined these limitations in the first place? If it were determined by a finite thing outside itself, an efficient cause, going on forever, it's an infinite regress fallacy. If it was determined by the building blocks inside itself, a material cause going on forever into smaller and smaller blocks, it's another infinite regress fallacy. The only possibility left is that all forms and limited characteristics of all finite things were ultimately created by something that has no finite limitations itself, i.e. something infinite, which has no limits that need determining by something else, and therefore is the ultimate or necessary thing, and it creates all other things. The Quran calls God Al-Khaliq, the creator. 4, atheism rejects the only sound explanation for the specificity of finite things. Things in the universe, including the magnitude of the forces of gravity, strong, weak, and force, and electromagnetism, and the amount of energy contained in the universe, are specific to a certain magnitude, size, quantity, and quality. Considering that the universe could have 1 quark more than it has, the question is, what determined it would be one way and not another? Perhaps the conditions prior to the universe's emergence, shall we say, led to the conditions we see now. But this only shifts the burden of explanation further along the chain. What then determined the precise pre-existing conditions before the universe that led to our universe being the way it is? If we invoke an infinite chain of pre-existing conditions to explain our current condition or the condition of the emergence of the universe, this is yet again another infinite regress fallacy, I'm afraid. The only remaining explanation is that something ultimately chose or determined by its will all things to be the way they are. The Quran calls God Al-Musawwir, the shaper. Islam posits that God ultimately created and sustained all things. He is infinite, unlimited, and self-sustaining, and He alone measured out the numbers of things and apportioned all the regularities, or what you call natural laws, behind all things. It is the Islamic concept of God that not only explains reality better than atheism, but it is the only explanation ultimately that can explain reality that we see, which does not possess self-contradictions, circular logics, or appeals to mystery or blind faith. The arguments of atheists, in my experience, are no different to those I've encountered from polytheists, Trinitarians, or volcano worshippers. Atheists just call their God the universe, which essentially is just a bigger volcano. Thank you.
Thank you, Abdullah. Can I have someone from side opposition to go and speak? Thank you.
Well, good evening, everyone. I'd also like to extend my gratitude to the Oxford Forum for making this happen. I did have some things to say in preparation, but one thing that we have to understand before we can even begin this discussion is the concept of the burden of proof. I did have some things to say, like I mentioned, but I think I'd rather just tackle some of the misrepresentations that I think we've just seen of the position of atheism. The first is a rather important case, which is, do we actually have anything to prove as non-believers in God? Atheism, as Abdullah quite rightly suggests, is thought of by many as simply a lack of belief in God. And the point was raised that no, that can't be the case, because a lack of belief in God entails some belief in the opposite, or at least a belief in a universe that can be explained without God. This isn't the case. Atheism is a claim to belief. It comes from the Greek, a meaning without, theos meaning God. It simply means living your life without the influence of a God. It's not an active position to hold. Many people would call it agnosticism, because we're simply saying, well, there's no good reason to believe in a God, but we're not saying that we believe there isn't one. But agnosticism is a claim to knowledge. Gnosticism is knowledge. Theism is belief. I simply say, I don't know, therefore I don't believe. Whereas the proposition seem to have to say that they also don't know, because nobody can know for certain, and yet they do believe. And what we need to see tonight, in order to agree with the proposition and have them win the debate, is the reason why they're able to take that extra step that we simply can't. So let me explain with an analogy that comes from a friend of mine called Matt Delahunty, who has given the example of a gumball, a jar of gumballs. What's essentially happening here is we've got a jar of gumballs, and we have no idea how many gumballs are in the jar. And the people to my right are pointing it and saying there are an even number of gumballs in that jar. And I say, you have no good reason to believe that. I don't believe you. And they say, oh, so that entails that you think there's an odd number. Well, of course it doesn't. It just means I don't believe that there's an even number. Just because I don't believe that there's a God doesn't mean I do believe that there's not one. And that's an important point to make clear, because it demonstrates the fact that the burden of proof lies with the proposition. If you, ladies and gentlemen, are not convinced by either side in the debate this evening, then the default position has to be atheism. The default position has to be there's no good reason to believe either way, and so we simply don't believe in Islam. That's why the title of the debate is something of a false dichotomy. But the burden of proof certainly lies with the proposition. But that's not a problem, because there were a number of arguments put forward in an attempt to try and fulfill that proof, which it's worth briefly touching on. For instance, when you bring up the point, Abdullah, about matter, you ask the question, what are superstrings made of? Talking about, I presume, the kind of quantum strings that are thought to be, according to string theory, at the basis of the universe. And you say, essentially, well, what are these made of? And what would that be made of? And what would that be made of? Well, the answer is quite simple. It's, I don't know, and neither do you. And that's the point. Neither of us know. And so I'm simply saying that because we have no reason to know what's at the basis of this reality, what's at the basis of matter, the best thing we can do is throw up our hands and say, until good evidence comes along to believe that it is due to some kind of divine supernatural creator, let's not do so. And certainly, let's not instill that supernatural creator with certain qualities that are an extra leap of faith that you can't take that extra step before you've made the first. Also, on the point of change, you talk about infinite regress, which is problematic. Of course, the problem of everything needing a cause, everything needing an explanation for its existence, whether you frame it as a contingency argument or a cosmological argument, of course, trivially applies to the creator himself, or of course the creator, of course, unless you adopt something of a Kalam cosmological argument that says that, well, we're not talking about everything needing a cause, because, of course, like I say, it would trivially include the creator of the universe. Instead, it's things that begin to exist that need a cause. It's things that have some kind of that have some kind of cause that brings them into existence. The fact of the matter is we have no experience with that. You say that there are atheists who believe that things can come out of nothing. There's no good reason to think that something can't come out of nothing. People often say it's ridiculous to suggest that something can come from nothing. You're not all worried that a hippo has just materialized in your living room while you're out here. But your living room isn't nothing. In fact, there's no nothing in the universe. Lawrence Krauss has shown that if you take away, or written that if you take away every piece of matter from a finite space, and you remove not just the matter, but the radiation and everything that we can conceivably call matter, it still weighs something. Now, that might be a practical limitation. Perhaps there is nothing somewhere, and we just haven't been able to access it or create it by removing the sufficient matter in the universe. But the fact of the matter is we have no experience with nothing, and so to say something can't come from nothing is an unjustifiable claim. We've never had any nothing to try it with. In fact, the only time there was nothing, if there was nothing ever at all, must have been before the universe was created. And so the only thing that has actually begun to exist in any meaningful sense is the universe itself. And if the argument is that everything that begins to exist has some kind of cause, and so the universe must have some kind of cause, well, everything that begins to exist is the universe. So when you say everything that begins to exist needs a cause, you're just saying the universe needs a cause. And the conclusion is, of course, that the universe has a cause. And that's the definition of a circular argument. Now, that's the first point. The second thing I'd like to do, I'm not sure how long I've been up here now. I haven't got a good track on time. How long? 5 minutes. 5 minutes. Okay, so about halfway through. So let me put to you some of the things that I was thinking of putting forward. Did I not have anything to respond to in the propositions case? I'm sure that there's going to be a lot of discussion of metaphysics this evening. There's going to be a lot of discussion of arguments for the existence of God, the existential arguments, let's call them. And so I wanted to take a brief moment to bring up what might seem like an irrelevancy, but is certainly not. Islam teaches that there is an objective basis to morality in the world. That when you say something is right or wrong, that is a true statement, and that's as true as something like the proposition that the earth orbits the sun. It is a matter of fact. And that means that part of the reality that we're trying to describe with the Islamic worldview is moral realism. There have to be moral truths that are as real as the metaphysical claims that it's making. And what that means, ladies and gentlemen, is that if you find moral claims within the doctrines of Islam that you don't agree with, then you don't agree with Islam. So I want to consider some of the moral elements of this religion and see if it's something that you would be able to throw your weight behind. There are, of course, many examples that I could choose from, but one of the most important areas and one of the most often spoken about areas is the treatment of women. Now, this is problematic because a lot of the time people will point to practical examples. They'll say, look at Saudi Arabia. Women weren't able to drive until very recently, but this is ridiculous. Saudi Arabia can quite easily be shown to not be a real Islamic state, and it's very easy to make a case that that's the state and not the religion. So let's turn to the doctrine itself. Let's turn to the scripture. What do we find? Well, there's a very famous verse in the Quran, and I'm sure this is nothing that the proposition hasn't come up against before, but I'd like to hear some kind of justification for these things, and I'm sure they'll be able to provide them. In the Quran, Surah 4, verse 34, I'm sure you're familiar with, is the verse which I'll quote to you. Men are in charge of women by right of what Allah has given one over the other, and what they spend for maintenance from their wealth. So righteous are women who are devoutly obedient, guarding in their husband's absence what Allah would have them guard. But those wives from whom you fear arrogance, first advise them, then if they persist, forsake them in bed, and finally strike them. But if they obey you, seek no means against them. Indeed, Allah is ever exalted and grand. So what we have is a situation where if a wife is disobedient, of course first you try to talk them out of it. Second, you stop having sex with them. But that really doesn't work. But then you strike them. Now, okay. Perhaps this isn't a thing about women. Perhaps this is just a thing about violent behavior. It's just about striking people who are disobedient, and not even disobedient to the husband, but disobedient to God. If someone's being disobedient to God, then they need to be set right. And perhaps the only way to do that sometimes is with physical violence. Well, okay, if that's the case, then let's look at a comparison from a hadith reported by Al-Hakim on disobedient men. So this is in reference to wives talking about their husbands. She should not beat him in case she is stronger than he. If he is more in the wrong than she should plead with him until he is reconciled. If he accepts her pleading, all well and good, and her plea will be accepted by Allah. While if he is not reconciled with her, her plea will have reached Allah in any case. So if a woman is disobedient to a man or disobedient to a god, whichever framework you want to think about it, the first thing that the wife should do, if the man is disobedient, is to try and talk him out of it. And if that doesn't work, it's not a problem, because Allah's going to hear it anyway. But if a wife's disobedient to a husband, then sure, he should still try and talk her out of it. But if that doesn't work, well then you can strike them. Seems to be a bit of an inequality here. And that inequality is only highlighted when we look at the rest of that same hadith. It's preceded by the following. It is not lawful for a woman who believes Allah to allow anyone. It is not lawful for a woman who believes in Allah to allow anyone in her husband's house while he dislikes it. Okay, well, back in the times that this book was written, men were primarily the owners of wealth, so it makes sense if the man is the owner of the property, perhaps it should be his decision who's allowed on the property. That's not so much a problem. But let's continue. She should not go out of the house if he dislikes it, and should not obey anyone who contradicts his orders. It's getting a bit more questionable now. And to finish off, the very next sentence is, she should not refuse to share his bed. And you can take that to mean what you will. But I'll remind you that if you find any of this objectionable, then you should find objectionable the doctrines from which they spring. Another thing I'd like to talk about, and I'm certain, because I've certainly seen Mr. Hijab respond to this in the past, and it's something I'd love to dive into, is the marriage of the Prophet to Aisha, as certainly the Muslim members of our audience this evening will be aware of, but perhaps not everybody. Muhammad, while in his 50s, married a young girl called Aisha, and I say young, she was 6 at the time. Not 16 or 60, but 6. Now, of course, he didn't consummate the marriage when she was 6 years old. That would be quite outrageous. He waited another 3 years until she was 9. And the proposition has to defend the idea that that was ever morally permissible. And I think that's my time. Is that my time?
Yes.
Well, that's all I've got, but believe me, I have more. So we'll leave it for the rebuttal stage. But thank you.
If the next speaker on proposition, Mohammed, thank you.
I want to thank everyone for coming today. Thank you very much for coming. It's first day of Ramadan for us, and we're happy to have you. Now, I've come here, me and Abdullah, actually, we've come here to refute magic. Wait a minute, what did you say? Let me say that one more time. We've come here to refute magic. It's actually an interesting magic trick where there is no bunny. There's no hat. And in fact, there's no magician at all. It's the proposition that something can come from nothing. Not only from nothing, ladies and gentlemen, but from nothing and by nothing. The Quran says, أَمْ خُلِقُوا مِنْ غَيْرِ شَيْءٍ أَمْ هُمُ الْخَالِقُونَ أَمْ خَلَقُوا السَّمَاوَاتِ وَالْأَرْضِ بَلْ لَا يُوقِنُونَ. Were they created from nothing? Or were they themselves the creators of themselves? Now we've heard Alex today, for the second time I've heard him say this. He says that the universe may have come into existence from nothing. Minute 14 to 15 in his video, Does the Universe Have a Cause? He says, when the universe came into existence, it well and truly came into existence from nothing. Now, wait a minute. Ladies and gentlemen, I have a challenge. That's an active claim. He said, I'm not here to make any active claims. Sorry, that is an active claim. Look at the syntax of that particular sentence. You are saying the universe came into existence from nothing. Don't pretend to be passive. Oh, I don't know. No, you do know. You're making a statement. Either you know what you're saying or you don't. Tell me how the universe came into existence from nothing and by nothing, ex nihilo. I want to know. Tell me how that's possible metaphysically, ontologically, cosmologically, from first principles. Give me the answer, please. But it's interesting because in his other video, Something from Nothing, where he was debating the contingency argument with a fellow American, or an American man, minute 48, he says this, listen to this. He agrees with the radio guy that was speaking to him that the universe is a necessary existence. Wait a minute. What's going on here, ladies and gentlemen? What does necessary existence mean? A necessary fact is a fact that cannot be any other way. 2 + 2 = 4. That's eternally going to be the case. So a necessary existence is eternal. It cannot be any other way. So wait a minute, if the universe is eternal, how could it come from nothing? Contradiction. It's a contradiction. You can't have it both ways, my friend. And this is what atheism leads you to. Contradictory set of propositions. Either you have your cake or you want to eat it, what are you going to do with it? Tell me now, did the universe come from nothing? If so, how so? That's an active claim. Is the universe a necessary existence? If so, how so? That is an active claim. Is it eternal? Just, come on, please. Don't pretend to be innocent and agnostic. Number 2, you could say, no, there's a multiverse, or there's an eternal fabric, or there's an eternal universe. But a multiverse has the propensity of being any other way. And, I'm sure you study philosophy, you know what you're talking about. A possible existence, or a contingent existence, is defined by being able to be rearranged in any other way. If it can be arranged in another way, it's not necessary. It's possible or contingent. It's not necessary. So a multiverse cannot be necessary existence because it can be arranged in another way. It can be out of existence. So wait a minute. This is very important, guys. Hold on. You agree that there should and ought to be a necessary existence. If you agree with me on that, then you're not an atheist. Because the necessary existence is the Islamic definition of God. قُلْ هُوَ اللَّهُ أَحَدٌ. Say He is one and only. The self-sufficient, the independent. Meaning, the necessary existence. لَمْ يَلِدْ وَلَمْ يُولَدْ. He begets not, nor is He begotten. Meaning He's eternal. If you say that there's a necessary existence, you cannot say you're an atheist. From an Islamic perspective. And from a philosophical one. Moreover, we have to ask a question now. We're talking about Islam. So, why is Islam any different from any other religion? Because Islam talks about one necessary existence, one independent, one self-sufficient. Not 3 in 1, 1 in 3. Not a triune God. Not a multiplicity of gods, a plethora of gods. Not a pantheism. And by the way, I have to make this clear now. It was a bit of a straw man argument because Alex came up and says that Abdullah said that the universe has a cause. He never said that in the statement. But he had these written things. We never use the word cause. You can have a necessary existence, you can make an ontological argument for a necessary existence without causation at all. There's a difference between possibility and contingency, on the one hand, or necessity and causation. You don't even need to, you can have it. You don't believe in causation before the universe? Fallacy of composition? Have it, no problem. You have to explain how there can be a world with only possible existences. How can there be a world with only possible existences? If you say there can't be, and we're happy to say there's a necessary existence, you're no longer an atheist from an Islamic perspective. Because you believe in an independent, self-sufficient thing that everything depends upon. And that is the ultimate explanation for all of existence. Now, a secondary point we need to make is that Islam, the concept of God, the Tawheed, the monotheism, is something not only intuitive, but it's something, as we've seen, that can be reasoned from first principles, ladies and gentlemen. And that's why, already when we just look at the concept of God, so many of the major world religions are ruled out. Christianity is ruled out. Hinduism is ruled out. I would say Sikhism is ruled out. Why? Because of that pure monotheism, that respectable monotheism that Islam has to offer. But in addition to that, as Abdullah alluded to, the meta-narrative of there being many prophets aforetime, many of them with the same message of Islamic monotheism, believing in one God and worshipping one God, is something which can be seen in the religious books. What Abraham said, what Moses said, what did they come and say? Even according to Old Testament literature, calling the people to monotheism. So, Islam also has an inbuilt system of falsification. It works in a similar way to science in many ways. 4 challenges, which I'm happy to take questions on the questions and answer, or in the cross-examination. 1, if this book was from other than God, the Quran says about itself, there would have been many contradictions, chapter 4, verse 92. Number 2, the inimitability challenge. Try and produce something like it. And there is a quantifiable way of doing so, which we can talk about in the question and answers. Number 3, that Islam makes predictions about the future. And it specifies time and place. And this is my claim. It's the only religion to make a series of predictions about the future, none of which have not materialized. Whereas with anyone you want to mention who makes predictions of the future, at least some of their predictions will be falsified. And I'm willing to be tested on this. Test it. It's falsifiable. And in fact, this falsifiability is even stronger than the scientific one. Why? Because in scientific falsifiability, everything is susceptible to falsifiability. Everything that's done now, if I do a scientific experiment, now it can be falsified. But with a retrospective perspective, a hindsight perspective, if predictions have been made of the future, we can see whether those predictions are right or wrong. And we can talk about those predictions there's a book coming out called The Forbidden Prophecies by our era. That's going to be something which details that case in detail. Now the interesting thing is you have a nihilist, someone who does not believe in existential, he's an existential nihilist who's cosmic skeptic. He's an existential nihilist, a moral nihilist. He is an epistemological nihilist. He doesn't even believe in morality. And he's making a moral case today. I mean, I don't know how this works. I really don't know. He says, I subjectively value my liberty. In one of his videos, The Moral Argument, 1 hour and 16 minutes. Tell me how, from first principles, liberty works. Is it not based and predicated on a fictitious, hypothetical, mythological state of nature detailed by John Locke and Thomas Hobbes and those individuals? Where's the scientific evidence for that? Why do you believe that? Why do you believe in equality? John Locke established his equality on the hedonistic principle and on a theory of God. Now you're an atheist, try and find from first principles why you believe in equality. We as Muslims don't believe in second wave feminism. Simple as that. Yeah, there's some things in Islam which are different for men than to women. Why do I have to justify myself to you? You have to justify why that equality of that Eurocentric understanding of equality of second wave feminism in the 60s that emerged is the objective morality. That's you, that's an active claim that you've made. You have to substantiate it. But listen to what he says in his video, My Problem with Sam Harris's Morality. Can I finish off?
Yeah, you got a minute there.
If you go to Somalia and tell those women, why do you put those women in bags? They will accuse you of cultural imperialism. So why are you asking the women if they're put in bags? What kind of discussion is that? What kind of sanctimonious Orientalist understanding of morality is that? You have to first prove your morality. You're a subjective moralist. You don't believe in objective morality. Don't ask me about morality. You don't believe in it. Prove it. That's an active claim. And with that, guys, I want to say one last thing, which is that he made an egregious claim in one of his videos called The Liberal Hypocrisy on Islam. He said Islam is a racist religion. And I will tell you that Islam is the only religion ancient religion in the world which completely negates racism. Look at chapter 49, verse 13 of the Quran. Look at the Prophet. He said there's no virtue of a black man over a white man, an Arab or a non-Arab. Now, he's got 3 options. Option 1, to retract the statement. Option 2, Yes, option 2, to provide the evidence, or option 3, face public humiliation today. And there's no fourth option. So don't make claims about morality and about Islam if you haven't even read the Islamic literature and you don't know what is in its contents. Sorry for I know it's quite a, performance, but it's it's a passionate topic for us. I'm thanking everyone here, and I also thank Cosmic Skeptic for coming and for once speaking to the Muslim community rather than about them. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much for that, Mohammed. Now can we hear from Colin Brewer?
I'm a bit of an amateur at this. These guys are all more or less professional. I wish I was as certain of anything as the people on this side of the table seem to be of absolutely everything. And I want to start by not singling out Islam particularly, because Islam is just one of those monotheisms that seems to find atheism terribly worrying. I mean, whether the theistic religions believe in one god or many gods, they're terrified of people who don't believe in any gods. And when they have the power to do so, and in the case of Christianity, when they had the power to do so, they routinely try to silence people like me at best by censorship, at worst by imprisonment, exile, or execution. And there's nothing particularly Islamic about this. Christianity was executing people just for being the wrong sort of Christian before Islam was a twinkle in Muhammad's eye. And they continued to do so until 1826, which was when the Spanish Inquisition executed its last victim. Here, I want to quote you a couple of worried Christians talking about atheism in the 17th century. One of them was both French theologians. One of them said, "I am afraid that atheist writings will disclose thoughts to me that would throw me into a fear from which I would not be able to return." And his contemporary, André d'Abillon, said that for such skeptics there is no punishment violent enough for so dark a crime. Even in our own relatively tolerant country, when Parliament was open to people who were not members of the Church of England, guess who came last? First of all, they let the Catholics in, about 1829. They let the Jews in about 1850. They let atheists in about 1880. So Christianity no longer has any power to liquidate people who question it, and almost everybody in Britain and most civilized countries is pleased about that. I'll explain what I mean by civilized in a moment. Islam has not lost that power. Not only that, but many people in Islamic countries, and in some Islamic countries, most of the people are very pleased that it has the power to do very nasty things to atheists. The Islamic countries were the only ones who refused to sign the part of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948 that said that deals with freedom of religious belief, including the freedom to change your religion or not to have one. And that's why I think that such countries are, in one very important sense, not totally, not altogether civilized. Last year, I was asked by a professor of English at the university in one of the more liberal Arab countries if I would write an article for his small Arab language departmental journal on Sigmund Freud's use of language. It will be published soon. I'm very proud of it. It'll be my first work to be published in Arabic. But it has one very important omission. Soon after I started writing it, I thought I'd better check with him whether it was okay to mention that Freud was an atheist. He said, "If you do that, they will immediately close down the journal and possibly my department as well." Now, you don't really persuade me that you get a better grip on reality when you spend your time trying to stop people from giving their views on various aspects of reality. And when you outlaw discussion about what reality might mean. And whatever we mean by reality, I suggest there are two broad types of reality. One is historical reality, which means an attempt to find out what really went on in the past. And the other sort of reality is current reality, things that we can examine, question now. So let's deal with historical ones first. A few years ago, I was on holiday in Morocco, and we hired a driver to take us around, and it was quite a long drive. He'd been to university in Britain. His English was excellent, and naturally enough, the discussion turned to Islam, and he was very keen to tell us his thoughts. And I learned from him that it is completely wrong that Jesus was the Son of God and that he died on the cross. Now, these are the fundamental tenets of Christianity. They don't get any more fundamental than that. And he said that probably, and there's a certain amount of debate about this among Islamic scholars, that it may have been actually Judas, suitably disguised, who died on the cross. Now, not being a theist, I don't particularly care which of them is right. They cannot both be right. Either Jesus died on the cross or he